From the moment she walked into the room, no one suspected there was anything extraordinary about her. She didn't carry herself with the kind of pomp or arrogance that would give away her lineage. There was no trace of a grand entrance, no subtle hints of privilege, just an ordinary woman in a world that was quick to judge based on appearances. People assumed they knew her story instantly, or at least, they thought they did. They saw her as approachable, maybe even unassuming, and that misperception allowed them to mislead her in ways they never would have dared if they knew the truth. At first, it was almost charming. Colleagues would casually offer her tasks beneath her capabilities, thinking she was grateful for even the smallest opportunity. Social circles would include her in conversations but rarely expect her to have any real influence or authority. Invitations were extended sparingly, often without the subtle respect that others of her social standing would automatically command. People assumed she was just another person in the crowd, someone whose background didn't matter, and in that assumption, they let their true intentions slip. They underestimated her, and in doing so, they made themselves vulnerable to their own misconceptions. It wasn't a malicious game at first, at least, not consciously. It was more a matter of habit, of pattern. People tend to measure others by what they can see, how they dress, how they speak, how they comport themselves in public. And she didn't wear wealth or influence like a badge. She wasn't flamboyant, she didn't boast of connections, and she certainly didn't flaunt the kind of power that comes from a legendary surname. She blended in seamlessly, moving through rooms and conversations without drawing attention, and that invisibility worked in her favor in ways few could anticipate. Even her closest acquaintances didn't think twice. They joked with her freely, teased her, sometimes even dismissed her opinions without a second thought. There was a subtle freedom in the way she navigated these spaces because no one expected her to have the weight of history behind her. She laughed along with their assumptions, quietly aware that the world was underestimating her, but never letting on just how much she actually knew or understood. There was a delicate balance in her interactions. She let people think they were in control, that they were the ones calling the shots, all while she observed, learned, and quietly noted the disparities between their perception and reality. The environment around her was rife with small deceptions, half-truths, and assumptions that were never challenged because no one thought it necessary to look deeper. People assumed that since she didn't broadcast her heritage, it must be ordinary, even mundane. And that assumption made them careless. Invitations would be extended under false pretenses, favors would be requested because they thought she would be compliant, and conversations were sometimes manipulated to see how far they could push her. It was almost like walking on a stage where everyone else thought they were the actors, unaware that she was the one quietly scripting the scene. Yet, despite being misled and underestimated, there was no bitterness in her approach. She moved through these interactions with a grace that was disarming, a quiet intelligence that hinted at something beneath the surface without revealing it outright. People were drawn to her for her warmth, her apparent ordinariness, and her ability to engage without pretense. And it was precisely this combination of humility and awareness that made the eventual revelation so powerful. They had built their assumptions on a foundation of ignorance, never realizing that she carried the legacy of one of the most formidable figures in history. Every glance, every word, every small interaction was a subtle dance between perception and reality. Those around her were unwitting participants in a narrative they didn't even know they were part of, and she played her role perfectly, observant but unobtrusive, intelligent but restrained, commanding attention in the quietest possible way. The world had misjudged her completely, and it was a mistake that would only become apparent later, in a moment that would leave everyone reeling once they realized exactly who she was. Until then, she existed in that unique space where invisibility was her greatest asset and underestimation her silent ally. Even as she navigated her daily life under the guise of normalcy, subtle clues began to surface that something about her was different, something that didn't fit the picture people had painted for themselves. At first, these hints were so small that most brushed them off, dismissing them as coincidence or imagination. A remark here, a gesture there, and yet, the sense of familiarity and distinction lingered in the back of their minds, quietly nagging at their assumptions. It wasn't overt or flashy, but there was an undeniable precision in the way she carried herself, a depth to her observations that suggested a mind trained by experience and history, even if no one could yet articulate why it felt so distinct. She would enter conversations with an awareness that exceeded what anyone expected, effortlessly referencing events, ideas, and personalities that seemed beyond the ordinary sphere of her peers. People noticed, though they tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was just well-read, or had traveled extensively, they told themselves. Yet, there were moments when her words struck with a weight that didn't belong to the casual small talk of everyday life. She might mention a strategic insight, a historical anecdote, or a familial connection to events that seemed strangely intimate. The casual listener would smile politely, nod, and move on, unaware that each subtle disclosure was like a breadcrumb hinting at a much larger truth. Her knowledge wasn't limited to books or surface-level trivia, it carried the authority of lived experience and inherited wisdom. There were glimmers of the larger legacy she carried, glimpses of the intellect and strategic thinking that had shaped generations. She had a way of framing ideas that suggested not only familiarity with history but also a personal connection to it. And even though she never directly revealed her identity, those who were perceptive enough to catch the nuance felt a curious mix of awe and unease. Something about her presence demanded a second look, a reassessment of the casual assumptions everyone had made about her. It wasn't just her intellect that gave her away, either. The way she reacted to certain situations, the quiet decisiveness, the calm under pressure, the unspoken expectation that things should be done properly, hinted at a pedigree that couldn't easily be faked. People began noticing patterns, small but consistent, a sharp observation here, an insistence on accuracy there, a way of speaking that carried the cadence of someone raised in a world of influence and responsibility. Friends and colleagues who had once assumed she was ordinary now found themselves questioning their own judgments. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Then there were the uncanny coincidences that seemed impossible to ignore. She knew people they shouldn't have expected her to know. She anticipated events before anyone else, often responding with a quiet confidence that suggested insider knowledge. Invitations arrived for her that seemed tailor-made, conversations were steered toward her effortlessly, and yet she never sought the spotlight. She moved through these moments with a natural ease, allowing others to wonder while she silently observed their assumptions crumble. Every interaction carried with it the unspoken message, there was more here than met the eye, far more than anyone had considered. Even those closest to her began to feel a subtle shift in perception. What had once been routine or casual interactions became tinged with curiosity and wariness. People started to second-guess themselves, wondering why they had underestimated her, why their assumptions hadn't matched reality. They began noticing the sophistication in her understanding of social dynamics, her uncanny memory for detail, and her ability to read situations with a clarity that seemed almost instinctual. It was as if she were playing a long, quiet game, letting others think they were ahead while she held the real advantage all along. And then came the small acknowledgments that hinted at recognition from others in her orbit, moments when her heritage brushed against the surface of daily life. A comment dropped accidentally, a familiar glance exchanged in passing, an offhand reference in conversation, all of them subtle, almost conspiratorial, but enough to send a ripple through those paying attention. It was in these tiny moments that people began to piece together a picture far different from the one they had assumed. The ordinary woman they had taken for granted was, in fact, extraordinary, and the realization began to stir unease, admiration, and a quiet sense of being outmaneuvered by someone they had once thought they understood. By the time the truth was ready to be revealed, the suspicion had already started to take root. People were looking for answers, noticing discrepancies they had previously ignored, and wondering what they had missed. The hints had been there all along, quietly accumulating like a slow-burning fire, preparing the stage for a revelation that would challenge every assumption, every judgment, and every casual misperception. What had started as subtle, almost imperceptible clues now formed a trail that could no longer be ignored, and it was only a matter of time before the full truth would finally come to light. The moment of revelation came quietly at first, almost unexpectedly, and yet it carried the weight of a thunderclap. It wasn't the kind of dramatic announcement you'd see in movies, with trumpets blaring or crowds gasping in unison. It was far subtler, a single comment in the right context, a whispered confirmation, and suddenly the room shifted. The ordinary assumptions that had guided everyone's behavior until that moment collapsed like a house of cards. People paused, blinked, and looked at her anew, finally seeing what they had been blind to for so long. She was not just remarkable in her intelligence, her wit, or her composure. She was the daughter of Winston Churchill, a living link to one of history's most formidable figures, and that truth changed everything in an instant. For those who had misled her, underestimated her, or casually brushed aside her presence, the realization hit like a jolt. There was a brief, almost comical pause in the room, the kind of stunned silence that comes when your brain tries to process something that contradicts everything you thought you knew. People exchanged glances, suddenly aware that they had been operating under a profound misunderstanding, that every assumption, every small slight, and every moment of underestimation had been entirely misplaced. What had seemed ordinary was extraordinary. What had seemed casual was deeply informed by history and legacy. She herself didn't react with triumph or vindication, at least not outwardly. There was a quiet grace in the way she received the revelation, a soft, almost knowing smile that suggested she had anticipated this moment for a long time. She had allowed others to misjudge her, to believe they were in control, and now, as the truth emerged, there was no need for anger or resentment. Her strength had always been in subtlety, in the ability to navigate spaces with awareness, intelligence, and poise without revealing her full hand until the time was right. And now, that time had come. The reactions of those around her were mixed, ranging from awe to embarrassment, admiration to regret. Colleagues who had once dismissed her opinions as trivial suddenly leaned forward, eager to hear her insights with renewed respect. Friends who had teased or underestimated her exchanged sheepish glances, suddenly aware that they had misread every cue, every interaction. Even strangers in casual conversation seemed to sense the shift, their expressions unconsciously acknowledging that this was a woman whose life and legacy carried far more significance than they could have imagined. It was the kind of revelation that ripples through a room, not with noise, but with a profound shift in perception. There was also a certain fascination in watching how people tried to reconcile their past behavior with this new truth. Some laughed nervously, attempting to mask their discomfort at having misjudged her. Others approached with cautious admiration, seeking to understand, to ask questions, to connect with someone who had lived a life shadowed by history. It was as though the room had collectively taken a step back, trying to catch up to the reality that she had always known how to navigate with quiet mastery. And yet, amid all the shock and recalibration, there was a human moment, a sense of recognition, of understanding, that transcended the lineage itself. People began to see not just the historical significance of her heritage, but the person behind it, the intelligence, the grace, the unassuming strength that had guided her through interactions where she had been underestimated. They realized that the lineage was only part of the story, what mattered equally was how she carried it, how she moved through the world with dignity, insight, and subtle authority. The revelation illuminated both history and character simultaneously, giving depth to every interaction that had preceded it. Some tried to laugh it off, as though humor could bridge the gap between past assumptions and present reality. Others simply stood in quiet awe, speechless, as if the truth had exceeded the limits of imagination. The moment wasn't just about identity, it was about the recalibration of perception, the understanding that appearances and assumptions can be dangerously misleading, and that the true measure of a person often lies beneath the surface. In that instant, everyone became painfully aware of the subtle misjudgments they had made, and yet, they also recognized the extraordinary patience, insight, and intelligence she had shown in allowing them to learn the truth in their own time. It was a revelation that transformed the dynamics of every relationship, every conversation, and every interaction. People approached her differently, not with the shallow deference of social convention, but with a genuine acknowledgement of her presence and her legacy. And she, in turn, moved through this new awareness with the same quiet grace that had defined her all along, proving that the power of perception is only as strong as the knowledge that informs it. By the end of that day, it was clear, she had been underestimated, misjudged, and misled, but she had emerged unshaken, and the revelation of her true identity had changed everything for everyone around her. The revelation of her identity didn't just create a momentary shock, it rippled outward, changing the way people interacted with her in ways both subtle and profound. Suddenly, every previous encounter was reframed in light of what they now knew. The small slights, the assumptions, the casual dismissals, they all took on a new meaning. People began to reflect on their own behavior, realizing that they had judged her based on appearances, on superficial cues, on assumptions that had nothing to do with who she truly was. There was a collective recognition that misjudgment had been easy, almost effortless, but that it came at the cost of understanding someone who possessed depth, intelligence, and a lineage that carried extraordinary weight. She herself navigated this shift with a calm dignity that was remarkable. She did not gloat, did not point out the mistakes of others, nor did she demand a sudden show of respect. Instead, she allowed the revelation to speak for itself, letting people adjust their perceptions naturally. It was in this quiet response that her true strength was revealed. She had the patience to let others stumble through their assumptions, the wisdom to remain composed while they recalibrated, and the grace to emerge from the experience without bitterness. Her reaction became a lesson in humility and poise, demonstrating that true power often lies in restraint rather than assertion. The aftermath also brought a new awareness of her influence, both socially and personally. People began to treat her words with care, listening with genuine attention, realizing that her insights were shaped by a perspective few could match. It wasn't just her connection to history that commanded respect, it was the intelligence, thoughtfulness, and awareness she consistently demonstrated. Where once she had been overlooked, she was now acknowledged, not out of obligation, but because people recognized that she had always deserved that attention. The shift was subtle at first, a leaning forward in conversation, a pause to consider her opinions, a renewed curiosity about her life and experiences. Friends and colleagues reflected on the assumptions they had made. They remembered moments when they had underestimated her abilities, dismissed her suggestions, or treated her as ordinary. There was an almost universal sense of embarrassment, but it was accompanied by admiration and, for many, inspiration. People began to understand the danger of making judgments based solely on perception. They realized how easily their assumptions had blinded them to the truth and how much richer their interactions could have been if they had approached her with awareness from the start. Her example became a quiet but powerful reminder of the importance of looking beyond the surface. The revelation also reshaped the social dynamics around her. Where once she had been just another face in the crowd, she was now someone whose presence carried weight. Invitations, conversations, and opportunities began to reflect a new level of respect and acknowledgement. And yet, she remained fundamentally the same person she had always been, thoughtful, intelligent, and composed. The world had adjusted to her, but she did not change herself to fit the expectations of others. In this way, she demonstrated that authenticity, paired with patience and subtle strategy, could command recognition in ways that overt displays of power rarely could. There was a reflective quality to these changes, both for her and for those around her. She observed how people now engaged with her, noticing the difference in tone, approach, and consideration. Those who had misjudged her were reminded of the fragility of assumptions and the value of curiosity and openness. And she, in turn, reflected on the patience it had taken to allow others to discover the truth themselves, understanding that the lessons people learned in the process were just as important as the revelation itself. It was a quiet triumph, a demonstration of resilience, intelligence, and the enduring power of identity that is lived with integrity rather than flaunted. Ultimately, the impact of the revelation extended beyond any single interaction. It served as a broader lesson about perception, legacy, and the consequences of underestimating others. The experience highlighted the importance of humility, both in those who had misjudged her and in the way she carried herself through it all. People walked away with a deeper awareness of how appearances can deceive, how history shapes individuals in subtle but profound ways, and how the quiet strength of a person often reveals itself most dramatically when others are least expecting it. By the time the initial shock had worn off, it was clear that nothing would ever be quite the same. She had transformed not just the way people saw her, but the way they thought about assumptions, respect, and the hidden depths that lie beneath the surface of every individual. And in that transformation, she remained herself, graceful, intelligent, and composed, leaving everyone who had misjudged her to reflect, reconsider, and ultimately recognize the extraordinary legacy that had quietly walked among them all along.